I'm pleased to welcome my dear friend David Newell to the show. David wears many hats. He's a writer, philosopher, consigliere, and more. He knows more about myths, the collective unconscious, and Carl Jung's works than anyone I know. And as he put it, the meaning and morality of one's life comes from one within oneself, Healthy, strong individuals seek self expansion by experimenting and by living dangerously. So, thanks for coming on the show, David.
Pleasure.
To start with, what is a myth and why should we care about them?
I think a myth could best be described as almost a unit of consciousness. There's this idea in the I Ching, in the Taoist philosophy, that consciousness learns through impact. So there is a being is then interrupted by an event, and the being responds to that event in some way. And if you think about the nature of story, that's always what's happening, right? There is a person, a protagonist moving through time and space, and an event must happening. And indeed, in fiction, we always say one of the golden rules of writing is always be escalating. You can't have a story that just goes flat for so long. And so a myth is the very first, the earliest example of humans' attempts to describe learnings of their consciousness through time. And so you can imagine that sitting around sharing stories of learnings was the earliest form of information and intelligence exchange. And these myths that have come up um, have essentially informed the deepest truths about human consciousness that we have. And what's interesting about them, and I think what kind of revolutionized Jung's work and latterly Joseph Campbell's work, is that similar stories, similar myths, similar motifs would appear in all of these different indigenous societies from all different parts of the world in different timelines, with incredible similarities, which led Jung to posit that there was some sort of deeper collective repository of wisdom that all of us had access to. And that was the kind of birth of his concept of archetypes and the collective unconscious.
And what it like when you say this that there is myths across indigenous cultures, like give me an example of one, a myth of good and evil or a myth of what is one of these stories that seems to have been conveyed across different cultures?
Well, a classic one that we would know in Europe would be Cinderella. And obviously that's been turned into Disney. Well, a lot of Disney stories have come from myths, but there are many, many, many different cross parallels for that. The Sumerian version of that, which is one of the oldest myths ever, is the myth of Inanna. And that's the myth of two sisters, Inanna and Eshragul. And Eshragul is the queen of hell, and or the underworld, as it's called in that myth. And Inanna wants to go see her, and in order to go see her, she must descend through 7 gates, and at each gate taking off each one of clothes until she gets to the bottom of the 7th gate and meets her sister, who, out of envy, hangs her up and kills her. And then the townspeople are so concerned that they send people after her to gather her remains, and then she's rebirthed and comes back into the world. And it's the oldest myth we have of this concept of going into the underworld and dying and being reborn. And the parallels to Cinderella are that she is, of course, one of several sisters. She's fallen, if you like. She's the one that's picked on. She's made to kind of roam through the houses and so forth and clean everything. And she's the last person that you would expect to go through this rebirthing experience. And she, through fate and fortune, finds her way to this ball and puts on the glass slipper, and that's the thing that redeems her basically and transforms her and allows this rebirth story. And Cinderella. Cinder is this concept of ashes,
Mm.
from death, from fire, she is reborn again.
Mm.
And there's lots of different derivations of this same myth
Mm.
around. Um, that's the most prominent one that comes to mind.
And do you see myths nowadays in the 21st century as mm, useful? And that's a really bad way to describe it. But what I mean by the question is that you know you and I would not. We're both guys in our 30s and 40s would not necessarily talk about Cinderella, right? Um, you would talk about it with kids or something, but like what is the like why is it still useful nowadays in terms of being able to understand the world as adults?
That's a great one. So I think like one of the things that we learn as adults or have to relearn, we're taught as children the concept of boundaries, right? Where everybody goes through the kind of toddler era. You have a young one at the moment where you're instrumental in doing this, right? And alive in her at the moment is this Mars archetype, this kind of testing of boundaries. Aries is the archetype of war, just wants to blaze through everything with anger and fire and passion. And that is what toddlers are doing at that age. And of course, they don't yet have access to um, uh, a psychic framework that can hold those archetypal energies, which is why they're just madness, right? That's coming through them. And it's the responsibility of the parents or the caregivers to mediate that archetypal energy that's pouring through them and say, no, it's not okay to throw, the spoon across the kitchen or whatever. And funnily enough, we re-go through this in adult life as we come out of what's essentially our parents' value system, that is enforced and has to be there in order for us to be sort of acculturated and civilized in society. We've all had that experience in our 20s and 30s where we see other people doing stuff that we feel uncomfortable with. And if we do enough self-inquiry, we realize that actually we don't really believe that stuff, or we do, but it's our conditioning that's made us there. It's our parents have said, no, you know what, maybe you shouldn't run around naked, at the swimming pool or whatever, when other people who maybe were raised in more hippie type families are perfectly comfortable with it. And you realize once you take your clothes off and jump in that the whole idea of being ashamed of your nakedness is a bit ridiculous. It's a civilized shame, right? And this battle between, but of course we do need boundaries. So what you're doing in adulthood is learning this what rather wonderful lesson of true discipline, true freedom comes
Mm.
from boundaries, but only when you set the boundaries. So
Mm.
you become conscious of it, right?
Mm.
You can't just run around naked around the city or whatever, but when you choose to take it off, then you can feel very, very free. And so, where this applies in myth is this concept. And so, in astrology, if we borrow from the archetypes there, you would have the myth of Uranus, which is chaos, is the archetype of chaos. And then you'd have Saturn, which is the archetype of time and boundaries. And
Mm.
these two are essentially at war with each other. And Saturn, Kronos, castrated Uranus.
Mm.
And so,
But explain that it said that Saturn castrated Uranus by cutting Uranus's
testicles
testicles and
off,
throwing them in the water.
correct, which then birthed Venus, Aphrodite.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. Cool.
yeah. What's important about putting these ideas in mythic form is realizing that they need containment, and that you can't be all of one thing. And some folks might think, why do I need to conceptualize of such raw energies in these stories? And this is the heart of like why myth is actually useful. And I'll give you a good example of this. I live in Bali, and there's lots of people there going through crises, personal development crises, trying to understand things and so forth. And there's a friend of mine, a Russian guy, a true artist. His mindset towards everything was just kind of like, screw it, like I want to play and just be free and blah blah blah. And he had two children and a wife there, and they had kind of fled from the Ukraine conflict and they were in Bali, and he was essentially going through, a midlife crisis where, funnily enough, that's when the Uranus in your chart comes online at 41, 42. It's called your Uranus opposition. So his psyche was exploding with this energy. And, this is where people go out and commit adultery, drive sports cars, insert middle-aged cliche here. And his version of it was very interesting. It was an unrestrained desire to just do dance every single day, which is very popular in Uber, ecstatic dance, contact dance, and so forth. This kind of 41-year-old man. Meanwhile, his financial position was absolutely like going through the floor. I mean, way in debt, people after him, business issues. And we were in circle together, and he would share about these things. And it was quite challenging for us to listen to, knowing that he had two young children to feed, right? This kind of sense of responsibility. Where are you taking the responsibility? And I would share with him basically like the archetypal struggle that was like playing out for him, between this Uranus energy that comes through and this Saturn. Money is a classic component of Saturn, right? Nothing will make you take responsibility more than not having any money anymore. And yeah, it was interesting to share with him that like these energies, these titanic energies in myth, always end in disaster. If you do too much of boundary, or if you do too much of freedom, you're going to end up polarizing to one of the extremes, and we see disaster. So I think it's very useful to have a kind of a mythopoetic framework underneath some of these bigger things, because it really puts a frame around the chaos that can unfold even in adult life, that necessarily happens in like adolescence, but doesn't necessarily need to happen in adult life.
It's interesting you use the word chaos, because Jordan Peterson talks a lot about order and chaos. Is that the two, Saturn and Uranus?
You could think, yeah, so
Yeah.
there's so many different archetypal languages or lenses from which to draw those things, but yes, yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. So then, as you're talking to this friend of yours in circle, he's going through all this. Do you ever sit there and go, well, how do I say this? Like, I am projecting onto him my own value set. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm personally,
And I wanted to get into like moral relativism, because that's also the I think, to me, the way I understand myths is a lot of times a way to convey stories that teach morality, or these yeah, like guidebooks, let's say, right? Like practical philosophy,
yeah,
and you do it in a way that is easy to understand, and that it it has stood the test of time, which is why you see these myths that are replicable across different cultures. It's like we know that these things are the ways,
yeah,
that like there's a reason that like envy, Cain and Abel, like the stories, like the story of Abraham, the ones that Jordan Peterson talks about from the Bible, are such that yeah, they draw on universal truths.
hmm
We'll
hmm
say, right?
yeah. Yeah, I mean that idea about am I projecting?
Yeah.
Yeah, is a great one, and projection is actually incredibly useful. And having these situations and people around you where they're describing these events is incredibly helpful, because in my view, all life is a stage.